"Sir, if they come, hide my sister." The boy said it the way a person confesses something quiet, urgent, stripped of everything except the truth underneath. He couldn't have been more than 9 years old. He was standing at the edge of Eli Cross's campfire, appearing from the dark the way children only appear when they have nowhere else to go. His hat gone, his boots splitting at one side of his face carrying a bruise that had gone purple and yellow at the edges, old enough to be healing, new enough to still matter. Eli didn't move. He was a careful man by nature and experience, and he'd learned long ago that the wrong move in the first moment could determine everything that followed. "Who are you?" he said. "Jacob," the boy said. "Jacob Raines." "How old are you, Jacob?" 10. He'd said it a half-second too fast, the way a boy does when he's been 11 for 2 months and still hasn't accepted it. Eli let it pass. "Where's your sister?" Jacob turned slightly, back toward the dark tree line 20 yards behind him, and made a small gesture, barely a movement, the kind of signal worked out between two people who'd been communicating in secret long enough to make it instinct. A few seconds passed. Then the brush at the tree line shifted, and a girl came forward. She was maybe 7. Small for it, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that had been neat once and was now coming apart. She was carrying something against her chest. Eli couldn't make it out in the firelight, just a dark bundle clutched tight the way children carry the things that matter. She stopped when she reached Jacob, pressed herself against his side, and watched Eli with eyes that were too large and too careful for a 7-year-old's face. Eli looked at the bruise on Jacob's face, looked at the girl, looked at the dark behind them, which offered no explanation. "Sit down," he said, "both of you." They sat on the far side of the fire, not quite across from him, positioned slightly to the which told him they'd learned to never put a fire between themselves and an exit. He pulled the skillet off the coals and cut what he'd made in half and handed it across without ceremony. Jacob took it and gave the larger portion to his sister without looking at her, automatically, as though it were a law he'd accepted long before this. The girl ate. Jacob didn't, not until he'd checked the darkness in every direction twice. Then he ate quickly, efficiently, the way someone eats when they've learned that meals don't always come twice. Eli poured water into his spare tin cup and set it between them. He said nothing. In his experience, silence after an offer of food was the kindest possible invitation because it removed the pressure of it and let the person decide on their own terms. Jacob was quiet for a while. The fire popped and settled. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl announced itself and went silent. "Her name's Clara," Jacob said finally about his sister. He didn't look at Eli when he said it. He was watching the eastern tree line. "She doesn't talk. She used to, but she stopped about 3 weeks ago." He said it plainly, without seeking sympathy, just establishing facts. "The man who runs the cutter operation, Harlan Cutter, he came to our farm. We owe him money. Or Pa did. Pa died in February. Now Cutter says the debt carries to us." The fire shifted, sending a brief column of sparks upward into the black New Mexico sky. Eli watched them rise and vanish. "Carries to you," he repeated. "He wants Clara," Jacob said. And now his voice changed not much, but enough. A tightening in it, a thing held carefully that wanted to break. He said she's worth the debt. He'd take her to his house in Dunmore. "For work," he says. Jacob's jaw set, going hard in a way that a child's jaw shouldn't be able to. "I know what that means." The night seemed to go very still. Eli Cross was 34 years old. He'd worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, had been a deputy in 2 territories, had seen things that had reduced him and things that had built him back. He was not a man who was easily shaken. He was the kind of man who, over the years, had made a careful study of his own limits, what he could carry, and what he would step into, and what he would walk past for the sake of his own continued survival. He looked at the girl, Clara, who was sitting pressed against her brother with the bundle against her chest, her two large eyes watching the fire, somewhere far away inside herself. He thought about walking past. He knew before the thought completed itself that he wouldn't. "How many men does Cutter have?" he asked. Jacob looked at him for the first time since he'd started talking. A look of raw, startled relief, the look of a person who has braced for the answer, "not my problem," and received something entirely different. It took him a moment to recover himself. 6, Jacob said. "Maybe 8. He's got a foreman named Stiles. The others do what Stiles says." He paused. "They'll come looking by morning. We've been running for 2 days. I found your fire from the ridge." Eli nodded. He looked at his horse, picketed 10 yards off, who was watching all of this with the calm indifference of an animal that trusted his judgment. "Get some sleep," Eli said. "Both of you. I'll keep watch." Jacob stared at him. "You're not going to leave?" "I'm not going to leave," Eli said. The boy looked like he wanted to ask why a stranger, why a cowboy with no stake in any of this, why tonight? But he didn't. Maybe he was afraid the answer wouldn't hold up to examination. Maybe he was simply too tired. He settled his sister against him, and Clara went easily, already more than halfway into sleep, still holding her bundle. In 5 minutes, they were both under the warmth of Eli's spare blanket. He sat by the fire through the rest of the night, his rifle across his knee, watching the darkness where the eastern road came through the trees, listening for hoofbeats, listening for voices, listening for the particular silence that meant men moving with intent. The fire burned low. He fed it, careful and quiet. He thought, in the morning, this gets harder. He thought, in the morning, I'll figure out how to... He looked at Clara's face, slack in sleep now, the 7-year-old showing through the armor at last. He fed the fire again. At first light, Eli made a decision he knew would cost him. He'd been turning it over through the night hours, working it the way he worked a problem with a horse, not forcing it, not rushing it, just staying present with it until the thing clarified. He'd looked at it from every angle he could find. And every angle came back to the same conclusion. He couldn't ride these children into Dunmore. That was the nearest town, 12 miles east, and Dunmore was Harlan Cutter's town in all the ways that mattered: his money in the bank, his men on the street, the sheriff drawing a wage that came, indirectly, from Cutter's pocket. Riding into Dunmore with Jacob and Clara Raines would be the same as delivering them to the man they were running from, just with better road conditions. He couldn't send them on alone. That required no analysis. He couldn't ride south toward open country. Cutter's men would expect a flight toward open ground, and they'd cover the southern approaches first, because men who ran operations like Cutter's had run this arithmetic before. Which left one option, the one he'd been avoiding looking at directly, the way you avoid looking at a bright light. There was a settlement called Hatcher's Ford, 22 miles northwest, up in the Mesa country where the land went red and rough and difficult. Cattle country, mostly, with a handful of families that had been there long enough to have opinions about outside interference in local matters. Eli knew one of those families, the Dearborn family, specifically a woman named Ruth Dearborn, who had been his father's closest friend in the years before his father died, and who had once, 15 years ago, hidden 3 Comanche children in her root cellar for a week, while the territorial militia searched her property twice and found nothing. Ruth Dearborn would help. He was certain of that. She was the kind of woman who couldn't be otherwise. But Hatcher's Ford was 22 miles of rough country, and they had 2 children on foot, 1 horse, and a group of riders who would pick up the trail within hours. He was still sitting with this when Jacob woke. The boy came awake the same way he did everything, quietly, with immediate attention. He sat up, looked at the sky, and then looked at Eli. "You're still here," Jacob said. Surprise in it, carefully controlled. "I said I would be." Eli handed him the last of the water. Wake your sister, Jen. Clara came awake slowly, surfacing from sleep with the particular reluctance of children who know the waking world is harder than the sleeping one. She looked at Eli, looked at her brother, and pressed herself closer to Jacob, with her bundle still clutched against her. The bundle shifted slightly, and Eli saw, for a moment, what it contained: a small rag doll with yellow yarn hair and a blue dress, worn smooth from years of handling. Clara caught him looking and pulled the bundle tighter, and he looked away. We're going to a place called Hatcher's Ford, Eli said. There's a woman there who'll take you in until I can get word to the federal land office in Santa Fe. There's a land dispute attorney, there's a man named Prescott, who handles cases like this. Debt disputes, property challenge. If your father's debt was based on a crooked agreement, which most of Cutter's agreements are, Prescott can challenge it. Jacob looked at him carefully. That takes time, he said. It takes time, Eli agreed. But it makes it permanent. A gun makes it temporary. A legal ruling makes it permanent. He paused. I've seen men like Cutter lose in courts. It happens less often than it should, but it happened. Jacob was quiet for a moment, working through it. He had the kind of mind that Eli recognized: methodical, honest, not looking for reassurance but for the actual shape of the thing. What do we do if they catch us before we get there? We make sure they don't catch us, Eli said. He broke camp without further discussion, scattering the fire with practiced efficiency, burying the ash under loose earth, brushing the campsite with a pine branch to disrupt the pattern of their resting old skills, trail skills, the habits of a man who had spent years making himself difficult to follow. He put Clara on the horse, which accepted her weight with the patient grace of a well-trained animal. Jacob walked beside Eli, setting a pace that was better than Eli expected from a child. They'd been moving for 2 hours when they heard the riders, not directly behind them off to the south, moving east. Cutter's men sweeping the southern route as he'd predicted, which meant they had time, but not much of it. When the southern sweep came back empty, the riders would turn north and begin working the mesa approaches. Eli picked up the pace without explaining it. Jacob heard the hoofbeats too, and understood without being told. Clara rode in silence, one hand tangled in the horse's mane, the other holding the bundle. They passed the Raines farm at mid-morning, a detour Eli hadn't planned, but found himself making anyway when Jacob went quiet in a particular way, staring northward toward a low hill, and Eli looked and saw the roofline of a farmhouse through the pines. That's ours, Jacob said. Just that. Eli stopped. He looked at the farmhouse, small, weathered, clearly unmaintained for months, the garden gone to seed, the grave marker at the property edge, new wood, the earth around it still dark and unsettled. He looked at Clara. She had turned her face away from the farmhouse, pressing it against the horse's neck. Do you need to stop? Eli asked Jacob. The boy stood very still, looking at the roofline. He had the expression of someone memorizing something, fixing it in place, putting it somewhere safe. No, he said. His voice was steady and terrible. We need to keep moving. He started walking again without waiting for Eli to agree. Eli followed, leading the horse, watching the boy's straight back and the iron in his spine that had no business being there at 11 years old. He thought about Harlan Cutter, who had looked at these children after their father's death and seen an asset and a debt instrument. The anger that moved through him was cold and specific, the kind that doesn't shout. They heard the second group of riders at noon, and this time they were not south of them, sweeping away. They were north. Ahead, Eli stopped on the trail and held up his hand and listened. The sound was intermittent, carried on the wind in fragments, but he'd spent enough years tracking and being tracked to read what fragments could tell. 3 horses, moving slowly. Methodical, not urgent, not pursuit, but a flanking group sent to cut off the northern approach while the southern party swept back up. Someone in Cutter's operation had done this before. He pulled Jacob and Clara off the trail and into the cover of the pine scrub east of the path, moving low and quiet. The horse, a gray mare named Patience, which had earned the name, followed without objection, her feet finding quiet purchase on the needle-covered ground. He picketed her in a low depression between two boulders and pressed the children flat against the larger of the two. Clara had gone very still, not the stillness of fear, but something more absolute, the stillness of a child who has learned that being invisible is a survival skill. She pressed the bundle with the rag doll against her chest, and she did not move. Jacob crouched beside her, with his hand on her shoulder and his eyes tracking the tree line to the north. 3 riders came into view on the trail 20 yards from where they hid. Eli recognized the type immediately. Not the young or the desperate, these were deliberate men, the kind of hired hand that a certain category of wealthy man keeps specifically for situations like this. The one in front had a way of scanning that was almost professional, quartering the ground methodically, missing nothing by accident, though he might choose to overlook certain things by decision. The man behind him rode with a shotgun across his saddle, already cocked, not theatrical, just practical. The third hung back, watching the back trail. They passed within 15 feet. Eli didn't breathe, felt the rock solid and cold against his back, smelled the pine and the horse sweat and his own tension. Clara was absolutely motionless. Jacob's jaw was clenched so tight that Eli could see the muscle working at the side of his face. The riders moved past, continued south down the trail. Nobody breathed for 30 seconds. Then Jacob turned to Eli and mouthed, "More coming?" Eli held up 2 fingers, waited, listened, then he shook his head. The 2 groups were going to converge somewhere to the south, which gave them the north for now. He made the decision quickly, the way he'd learned to make decisions in moments when slow thinking was the most dangerous option available. They couldn't stay on the trail. Cutter's men were working it systematically, and the next pass would be slower, more careful, and they wouldn't stay lucky twice. He knew this country. He'd ridden through it 3 years ago on a cattle drive, and there was a creek that ran northeast from here, called Dalton's Creek, that cut through the mesa in a narrow gorge where horses couldn't easily follow and where the stone walls broke the sound of movement. If they got into the gorge, they could move fast and covered for 4 miles, coming out on the northwestern side of the mesa less than 6 miles from Hatcher's Ford. The problem was the open ground between here and the gorge entrance, nearly half a mile of relatively exposed terrain. He explained it to Jacob in a low voice, fast, watching the boy's face work through it. "Can Clara run if she has to?" he asked. Jacob looked at his sister. "She can run," he said. "Certain of it. Stay low. Stay with me. Don't stop for anything." They moved. The open ground took 11 minutes that felt much longer. Eli kept himself between the children and the southern approach, which meant he was walking backwards for the last 200 yards, watching the trail behind them, his rifle ready. The sun was high and hard, and the scrub offered sporadic cover at best, enough to make a moving person difficult to fix from a distance, not enough to make them invisible. They were 40 yards from the gorge entrance when the shout came from the south. One of the riders had turned back early. He was on the ridge above the trail, maybe 200 yards away, and he'd seen them. Eli heard the shot a second after the shout, the round kicking up dirt 8 feet to his right. "Run," he said. They ran. Clara was fast. Jacob had not overstated it. She moved with the flat-out, desperate efficiency of a child running for something real, the bundle pressed to her chest, her braids streaming out behind her. Jacob ran beside her, hand hovering near her shoulder without touching, ready to catch. Eli ran behind them, turning every 4 or 5 strides to check the approach. The rider on the ridge was calling out, which meant he was alerting others, which meant they had minutes, not much more. They hit the gorge entrance and plunged into it, and immediately the sound changed. the open air of the mesa replaced by the close echo of stone walls, the creek running cold and quick at their feet. The sky narrowed to a strip of blue high above. The rider couldn't follow on horseback. Not in here. He heard the hoofbeats stop at the gorge entrance. He heard a voice the rider, furious, shouting instructions at someone to go around, to cut the northern exit off, to move. They had to move faster. "Keep going," Eli said. "Don't slow down." He looked at Clara, who was running with her face set and her eyes clear and the ragdoll bundle pressed against her heart, and he felt something in his chest tighten with a fierce and specific protectiveness that had no precedent in his experience. He ran. They came out of the gorge as the sun began its western descent, the sky going amber above the mesa's edge and the shadow of the stone walls stretching long and cool behind them. 6 miles to Hatcher's Ford. Eli pushed the pace for another mile before he let them stop at a place where the creek widened into a shallow pool and the cottonwoods grew thick enough to provide genuine cover from the trail. Clara sat immediately, not with defeat, just with the pure practicality of a child who has run as much as she can run and knows the difference between stopping and quitting. She set the bundle in her lap and looked at the pool and seemed, for a moment, to be somewhere other than where she was. Jacob sat beside her. He put his arm around her without making it a gesture. It was simply where his arm went when he sat next to her. Eli's knee was complaining. He'd caught it on the gorge wall during the run, a hard knock that had sent a bright spike of pain up through his leg, and that was now delivering a steadier, more editorial version of the same message. He sat on a flat rock and pulled off his boot and examined the knee bruised, not broken, the joint intact. He'd work through it. He looked up to find Jacob watching him. "You're hurt," Jacob said. "I'm fine. Your face says different." Eli looked at the boy, 12 years old, still 11, technically with a bruise on his own face that was still answering for itself, and he was clocking other people's pain. "It's nothing that won't keep," Eli said. Jacob reached into his coat and produced a strip of cloth clean, folded with care and held it out. Eli looked at it. "Mama used to keep bandaging in the coat lining," Jacob said. "I've still got some." He paused. "She said you always need it eventually." Eli took the strip, wrapped his knee with it, not because it would help much, but because the gesture deserved to be received properly. His hands were steady with the work, and he was aware of Jacob watching the steadiness, cataloging it. "Tell me about your father," Eli said when he'd finished. Jacob was quiet for a moment. Clara had opened the bundle and taken out the rag doll and was doing something deliberate with it, smoothing the yarn hair, straightening the blue dress. The movements were methodical and seemingly very important. Pa was a farmer, Jacob said, which sounds simple. He didn't look like much from outside. He was quiet, didn't argue much. People used to take that for weakness. He paused. He could read weather by looking at the sky, could tell you 3 days ahead what was coming, and he could fix anything: mechanical engines, pumps, mill equipment. People came from 40 miles to have Pa fix things. A pause, and when Jacob spoke again, his voice had gone careful, like someone handling something delicate. He used to say that the most important skill a man could have was knowing what he could fix and what he had to let go. Eli thought about that for a moment. He sounds like a man who'd earned what he knew. He had. Jacob looked at his sister. When Mama died, Clara was 4. He raised us by himself. He was both of them for a while. Another pause. He'd have hated that we're running. He'd have stayed and faced Cutter straight on. Would that have worked? Eli asked. Jacob was quiet for a moment, honest with it. No, he said finally. No, it wouldn't have. Cutter has too many men. Pa would have lost and taken us down with him. He looked at his hands. So maybe running was what he would have wanted, even if it wasn't what he would have done. The distinction between wanting and doing, between loving someone and emulating them sat in the air between them with a weight that felt earned. Eli reached into his saddlebag and took out a small object. He held it for a moment before he spoke, because it wasn't something he showed people. It was a letter, folded many times, the paper worn soft as cloth at the creases. He didn't open it. He just held it. "My father was a man who did the wrong thing for the right reason," he said. "He hid a man from the law once, a man who'd stolen food for his children during a bad winter. The sheriff came to our property, and Pa looked him in the eye and lied, flat out. He turned the letter in his hands, cost him his deputy badge. Reputation took years to come back." He looked at the letter. "He wrote me this when I was 18 and heading out on my own. Told me the one thing he wanted me to carry." He put the letter back without opening it. He said, "The right thing and the easy thing are almost never the same thing, and the gap between them is where a man's character lives." Jacob looked at him. Clara had stopped smoothing the doll's hair. She was listening. Eli was suddenly aware of it, that the child who hadn't spoken in 3 weeks was sitting absolutely still and listening with every part of herself. "That's what Pa meant too," Jacob said quietly, just in different words. A silence. The creek moved past them. The cottonwood leaves turned in the late afternoon wind, showing their silver undersides. Clara looked up. She looked directly at Eli, not from behind Jacob's shoulder, not sideways. Directly, her large eyes very clear, very present. She held out the rag, not to give it, to show it. The gesture was distinct. She was not releasing it. She was sharing it, which was a different and more intimate thing. Eli looked at the doll carefully. The yarn hair, the blue dress, the face worn smooth. "She's very fine," he said gravely, because the moment required gravity. Clara studied his face as he said it, checking whether he meant it. He held her gaze and kept his face open and honest. She seemed to find what she was looking for, because she drew the doll back against her chest and pressed her face briefly against the top of Jacob's arm. It was the first movement she had made that wasn't functional, the first purely tender thing. Jacob's throat worked. He looked at Eli over his sister's head with an expression that said everything that couldn't be said out loud. Eli stood. His knee answered, but he ignored it. 2 hours to Hatcher's Ford, he said. "We go now. We get there before full dark." Jacob stood. Clara stood, tucking the doll carefully back into the bundle. They walked. Ruth Dearborn opened her door at dusk without surprise, as though she'd been informed that something necessary was arriving and simply hadn't been told the shape it would take. She was 63, with white hair and hands that had worked cattle, gardens, and difficult situations with equal thoroughness. She looked at Eli, then at Jacob, then at Clara, and her expression settled into the particular calm of a woman who sees what is needed and begins immediately doing it. "Come in," she said, and stepped back. She fed them. She asked few questions, and the ones she asked were precise, not curious, but practical. What were the names? How many riders? Was the debt documented? Who was the opposing attorney if they could name one? Jacob answered every question with the same directness he brought to everything, and Ruth listened with a pen moving across paper that appeared from somewhere. And when he was done, she folded the paper and said, "I'll have someone ride to Santa Fe in the morning." Clara ate an entire bowl of stew without lifting her face from it. Then she sat by the fire with the rag doll and seemed, for the first time in Eli's observation, to fully inhabit wherever she was. It was later, Jacob asleep in the back room, Ruth gone to write her letters, Clara dozing by the fire, with the doll held loosely in one hand, that the riders came to Hatcher's. Eli heard them before they reached the Dearborn gate. He was at the window in 3 strides, And what he saw was not Cutter's men, not 8 hired hands moving with the assurance of men who owned the territory. What he saw was 5 riders with federal badges, and at the center of them a man he hadn't seen in 7 years, but recognized immediately, Deputy Marshal Asa Thorne, out of the Santa Fe office, heavy through the shoulders, careful with his eyes. He opened the door. Thorne pulled up and looked at him. "Eli Cross," he said. "Should have known." "How did you get here?" Eli said. Letter came to the Santa Fe office 4 days ago. Anonymous, detailed accounting of Harlan Cutter's debt practices, specifically the agreements he was running on deceased property holders, which is 3 separate federal violations. Thorne swung down from his horse. We were already building a case. This letter gave us the foundation to move. He paused. Know anything about who wrote it? Eli thought about the Dunmore schoolmaster he'd spoken to 3 months ago while passing through, the one who'd told him about Cutter's operation over a whiskey and had gone pale describing what he knew. The one Eli had quietly encouraged to write things can't say, he said. Thorne's expression suggested he could guess, but wouldn't press it. "Where are the Raines children?" he said. Inside safe, Eli looked at the deputy. "You're here for Cutter. We're here for Cutter. Yes, and for the formal debt dispute." He reached into his coat and produced a document. "The debt instrument Cutter holds against the Raines property is contested under federal law. It was drawn against a deceased individual without proper legal standing. Prescott in Santa Fe has filed on the children's behalf. The property stays theirs pending full resolution." He handed the document to Eli. "Which, given what we have on Cutter, is likely to resolve in the next 60 days. Eli held the document. The weight of it was unexpectedly significant paper, ink, the machinery of law finally moving in the direction it was supposed to move. Behind him, he heard the door. He turned. Jacob was standing in the doorway of Ruth's house. He'd woken without being called, the way he woke to everything immediately, completely, reading the scene with his methodical eyes. He saw the federal badge. He saw the document in Eli's hand. He looked at Eli's face, which told him what the document said before any words did. He didn't cry. He stood very still for a moment, and then his face did something complicated and private, and he pressed it quickly smooth. "Is it enough?" he said, meaning the document, meaning the law. Meaning, is this real, or is it just paper? "It's enough," Eli said. "Not everything yet, but enough." Jacob nodded once, turned to go back inside. "Jacob," Eli said. The boy stopped. "You kept her safe," Eli said, "from whatever it was, through all of it. You kept her safe." Jacob turned back, just partially. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was holding something together. "She kept me going," he said. "It worked both ways." He went inside. Harlan Cutter was arrested at his ranch in Dunmore 12 days later. The case built against him over the following months would prove larger than even Thorne's office had anticipated. Fraudulent debt instruments against 11 families, 2 documented land seizures using falsified agreements, and the testimony of 4 former employees who, once the structure of his protection collapsed, found their way to the federal office with considerable relief. The Dunmore sheriff resigned on a Tuesday and left the territory by Thursday. The Raines property was formally cleared of all debt in September. It took 61 days, which was nearly exactly what Thorne had predicted. Jacob and Clara remained at Hatcher's Ford through that time, under Ruth Dearborn's roof, which turned out to suit all parties. Ruth, who had no children of her own remaining and a working cattle property that needed young hands and a curious mind, found in Jacob someone who could read weather the same way his father had, by looking at the sky and knowing what it was about to say. She hired him properly. She taught Clara to keep books. Clara, for her part, began to speak again in early August, small words at first, single syllables, offered tentatively like a person testing ice. By September, she was talking steadily. though she chose her words with the care of someone who had learned that speech was not free. Eli Cross passed through Hatcher's Ford in October, on a drive coming down from the north, his route taking him naturally within 6 miles of the Dearborn place. He told himself it was convenience. Jacob met him at the gate. He'd grown not dramatically, but visibly, the way children grow when they've been fed properly and allowed to exist without constant fear. The tension that had lived in his back and jaw was still there at the edges, the way such things always remained, but it had loosened. "She's talking," Jacob said, before anything else. "I heard," Eli said. He dismounted and shook the boy's hand the way adults shake the hands of other adults when they mean it. "How are you?" "Better," Jacob said, meaning it precisely. They talked for an hour, standing in the mild October light, the mesa going gold behind them. Ruth brought coffee and joined them without ceremony. Clara appeared eventually from the direction of the barn, where she was apparently on excellent terms with 2 of the horses, and she looked at Eli for a moment and then held out the rag doll. Not to show, this time to give. Eli looked at the doll, then at Clara. Clara's face was entirely serious and entirely resolved. She had decided this before she came, and she was not reconsidering. "I can't take your mother's doll," he said. Clara looked at him steadily. "She gave it to me to keep safe," she said, and it was the first full sentence he'd heard from her, offered in a voice smaller than he'd expected and more certain than anything he'd heard in a long time. "It's safe now, so I can share it." The distinction between giving and sharing, between releasing and trusting, stopped something in his chest. He accepted the doll. He held it carefully. He tucked it, with equal care, into his coat pocket. He rode out in the late afternoon, south toward open country, the mesa dropping away behind him, the sky ahead going pink and wide and full of the particular western light that makes a man feel small in a way that doesn't diminish him. He kept one hand near his coat pocket, where the doll. He thought about a boy who'd appeared from the dark of a tree line and asked one thing, "Hide my sister," and had trusted a stranger with the most important thing he had. He thought about the gap between the right thing and the easy thing, and what lives there. The road opened ahead of him, long and clean in the evening light. Years later, in Hatcher's Ford, people would speak of the October that the cutter operation came down, the debt instruments voided, the families made whole, the sheriff's badge vacated and replaced. They'd talk about how it started with a letter, and how that letter started with a man who'd been asked one thing by a child in the dark and had said yes. In the Dearborn house, on the beam above the kitchen door, there were 2 things carved: a small horse, rough made, the work of a boy's hands, and beside it, one word. Yes, Clara Raines, who grew up to practice law in Santa Fe, and who was known for the precision of her language and the particular steadiness of her gaze, would tell people when they asked about the carving that it was the most important word she knew, because, she said, someone said it when they didn't have to, and everything else came after that.